So this panel is about warding and ritual safety. The audience is anyone who does rituals. Part of the purpose of this is to encourage people to have warders and to use good warding practices. So there is a little bit of preaching here of have warders, please. This was, do you guys want to say that you guys were organizing the facilitating?
So the two of us have facilitated this panel. We got all of these people to talk about it because we don't really know enough about it. But we have gone to rituals and we've seen some dangerous things and we've seen what can happen. And so we want to help make everyone safer. So we've gathered these very opinionated people together to yell at each other.
So there are, and thanks for bringing it up, we have people from very different sets of beliefs here. I think everyone here is, however, of the pro-safety belief. If there's anyone here who is anti-safety or in favor of just suffering and failure, I would ask you, this might not be the panel for you. But
or maybe it is.
Maybe actually this is really the panel for you. But we are, the purposes of this panel is not to resolve underlying conflicts of beliefs, just to talk about warding and ritual safety in a lot of contexts. So we hope it'll be valuable for people from a lot of different traditions, beliefs, and practices. My name is Ted, and I probably can't say a lot about my experience or practice. I'm here as a moderator. What I am here, so that's about me. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to introduce yourselves and concisely state what wording means to you. If you could, maybe about a 30-second bio about yourself and about 2 minutes about what your definition of warding is and what warding means to you. And we'll just go on down the line. Yep.
Hi, y'all. My name is Maia, and I have been doing this pagan thing since, we'll be kind and call it 1985 or so. And I've seen about 95% of the crap that can go wrong in a poorly constructed and poorly worded ritual. I was kind of eclecto-Wiccan for about 20 years. I've been heathen, Asatru specifically, for about 20 years. As heathens, specifically, we have some really strong feelings about warding and protection and about the safety of our congregants. So you might find that there's a slightly over-the-top heathen representation on our very diverse board. But for me, warding is about the safety of the people in the room who are there to experience the ritual and the safety of the celebrants who are busy and need someone to look after their needs as well. Warding is, for me, not just about the energy in the room and making sure that we don't accidentally leave somebody in hell or something like that, but also about the basic ritual hygiene of people constructing their rituals properly, presenting their rituals properly, and taking care of everybody who's there.
Hi there, I'm River Devora. I have also been a member of the Bay Area pagan community since 1993, doing different pagan and occult things for 10 or 15 years prior to that. Let's see, warding. So the technical dictionary definition of warding is to protect or to keep safe. So when we're applying that into spiritual, religious, ritual, or magical contexts, that's pretty much what we're talking about. From the perspective I'm coming from, when I'm looking at warding, I'm looking both at the physical and emotional safety of the living humans in the room, but also looking at the spiritual and magical safety of the people in the room as well. Like Maia, I've seen lots and lots of things go pear-shaped at rituals over the years. And a decent chunk of the time when I've seen things go sideways, it's because of magical or energetic stuff that hasn't been adequately managed or dealt with. So when I'm talking about warding, that's pretty strongly what I'm talking about. The other thing about warding, too, is that sometimes there's a piece about protecting the actual energies in the room, protecting the room itself, protecting the space from, again, more of a spiritual or magical perspective as well.
Hi, I'm Branwen, and I am a high priestess with the Come As You Are Coven of the Bay Area. Been with them for, about 8 years now. It is an eclectic sort of interfaith coven. All of us have various different personal practices. So I am personally Gaelic polytheist, but we have, Wiccans, we have your eclectic witchery, so on and so forth. And so our public rituals cover a wide variety of the spiritual spectrum, of energies, of what's happening. And so as a new tradition, it's been interesting to see the growth and dynamic of what needs to happen, what we need to have in order to create a safe space for our attendees, as well as our clergy, as well as the energies that we're bringing in. So for me, warding is definitely creating that safe container that becomes a sanctuary for the people that are in the room, as well as the spirits and the energies that are in the room. And it's an always evolving process.
Hi, I'm Shauna or Knight, and I'm the import from Chicago. So I have been traveling and teaching ritual facilitation for the past several years, and a lot of my work focuses on ritual logistics. So for me, I tend to go really back to brass tacks with a lot of this. For me, warding is about keeping the group safe. And, I tend to focus a lot more on the physical logistics of safety and greeting people and connecting to them and making sure that the people who are in the ritual are the right people to be in the ritual, and that someone who's going to have an episode is not in that space, or two people who have a conflict are not in the ritual together, or any number of different logistical things. So that's really the approach that I take. I come at it more as I'm a pantheist, and so I don't look at creating sacred space. I don't cast a circle when I do ritual. I believe that the space we're in is already sacred. We just need to wake up to it. So that's the approach that I take in ritual. I don't believe in purification in the sense, I don't believe I need to be purified. I believe that I need to get my mind ready for the work. So that's kind of the approach that I take. And so in some ways I might be a little bit of a devil's advocate on some of this, just because I focus so much on logistics. And yet I find it works. I find that I do not have ritual disasters when I set up agreements ahead of time and make sure that the right people are there. Although I do, of course, have some entertaining stories of ritual gone wrong.
And in fact, that's what we're going to talk about next. So part of this is definitely to convince you all to do this. I think people have, in general, a tendency to ignore or underrate dangers that they have not themselves experienced. And I'm hoping that perhaps if we start talking a little bit about things that have gone wrong from not warding, you can take this as a bit of precaution. What I wanted to do is ask each of our panelists to talk about a time that something went wrong due to a lack of warding or improper ritual safety or improper warding. I'd like to ask you not to name particular names or identify people, but please do tell these stories. The fact that nothing terrible has happened yet to someone doesn't mean that nothing terrible will ever happen and you can ignore safety. That is the case with safety in general. Ward to have a plan for problems before they happen. So on to our panelists.
Okay. I am happy to hear that Shauna focuses mostly on logistics too, because that tends to be where I am. I am paying attention to the energy focus of my celebrants and participants when I'm wording a ritual. But I'm frequently a lot more concerned about the fact that before the ritual ever starts, there's a lot of things you can do to make sure it's safe. An example of this having gone wrong was, we'll call it a decade ago. We had a ritual that was very impromptu, wherein the people who ended up designing the ritual allowed the deities that the ritual was for to do the designing on their own with no safety hatches, almost no warders. All of the celebrants in the ritual were possessed throughout the ritual design, throughout the ritual, and some of them didn't send the entities home afterwards. It's been 10 years. The people involved in that ritual are still experiencing fallout. So, and when I say fallout, I'm talking about the fact that some of them went so completely sideways after this ritual that they were hospitalized. Some of them have lasting mental health and relationship issues related to that ritual.
So, the story I'm going to tell about ritual warding gone sideways, or ritual safety not adequately attended to, is where I was the one who was harmed. When I was 18 years old, I kind of skipped out into the broader pagan community and was very, very excited to find everybody. I did not know what any of the words meant, and I didn't really know what to be asking or what to look for. I also didn't realize at that point that I was a medium. So this was back in the early 1990s when there wasn't really as much transpossession happening as I see now in the broader pagan community. These days it seems like practically, you throw a rock and you hit 5 mediums. But back then there was kind of this vague concept of aspecting, but most of the rituals I was finding my way into were rituals where the folks putting the rituals on weren't necessarily that clear either to the public or even necessarily with themselves and with their flock, what their actual take on theology was, if that makes sense. So if your actual ritual design folks are kind of like, well, maybe the gods exist and maybe they don't, but maybe they're archetypes and maybe they're not, hooray, we're just going to call them anyway and it's going to be awesome because at least people will have a spiritual experience, and isn't that great? Well, so there I was, 18 years old, not knowing the right questions to ask, and I started going to rituals because I was so excited to find other people. Up till then, I had been doing stuff solo and had been doing so since I was a very small child, and started going to rituals, and the rituals I was going to, they would start calling on the many faces of the goddess and then listing her names, or the many faces of the god and then listing his names, and then possibly doing various and sundry invocations to try and bring those energies into the room in some real way because they want folks to have a felt sense experience. And what was happening to me was that I was getting possessed because I was one of the only people in the room, apparently, who was an open head enough that the various and sundry stuff they were calling, or whatever else may have been around and attracted to the energies that were being invoked in the room, would kind of go, oh, I can drop in there, that's kind of cool. And I was getting possessed either during the rituals or sometimes afterwards, very, very much to my own detriment. It was a very frightening time for me, a very scary time. I didn't have anybody in my world who understood mediumship, and I had to stop going to pagan events altogether. I actually dropped out of the pagan community for about 6 years while I was working on getting my mediumship under control because the pagan community simply was not safe for me. So,
I would say that the very first ritual that comes to mind to me is the very first ritual that I went to where the fallout was immediate, and it wasn't a ritual that I was a part of. It was just a ritual that I was visiting, and the fallout of it had a lasting effect on several of our community, several people in my coven that we had all gone to the same ritual. And thereafter, I'm not a person who's easily possessed or has those sort of experiences. So for me, the fallout was a little bit not great, but something I could handle, like headache, really migraine kind of situation, very shaky, kind of the standard thing that happens because this ritual went into a deep meditative trance. There was lots of like intense energy flowing about. In fact, during the ritual, I remember very distinctly feeling the sort of hurricane energy that was building up in the room. And so then afterwards, though, several of my coven members who are significantly more sensitive to these kinds of things were having drastic physical reactions, shaking, crying, like excessive energy, unable to really stay focused. And then also some of our more grounded members that we rely on for warding and things like that were actually, during that ritual, said that they were taken out of that ritual, that their deities that they worked with were like, no, you can't stay here, kind of thing. This is not a safe place. And that experience really sort of imprinted in my mind that, you know, after staying up till like midnight trying to reward the room that I was staying in my own sanctuary, to get out what the things that had followed us outside of that ritual had latched on and followed us out, was sort of eye-opening to the things that can happen if you're just creating space and creating energy without that protection and without that boundary.
So I'm going to tell you a story about a small Midwestern town, which will remain unnamed, and anger management guy. So I was invited in to teach a ritual intensive in this small Midwestern town, and basically the way it was going to work is for in bulk, and I was going to teach some ritual workshops during the day, and then people from the class were going to take ritual roles and practice those during the in bulk ritual. It's a setup that I do very commonly. The problem was that there was a guy in the ritual. So it was a stations ritual where you've got like several different altars or shrines and people go to them. So we had 4 different aspects of Bridget. We had Bridget of the Hearth, I was Bridget of the Forge, we had Bridget of the Well, and we had Bridget of the Creative Fire. And when anger management guy gets over to the Bridget of the Hearth altar, where his very pregnant wife is speaking for Bridget, he starts muttering and rocking back and forth and seething, and I don't know what he was saying. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but he went into a full just saying some horrible stuff and really angry stuff, and I couldn't hear what he was saying, but it was really angry, and he starts seething. And I mean, this was a guy who I found out was he, you know, I'm not going to go into all of his stuff, but he really should not have been in that ritual. He had anger management issues. The people there were people there who knew he had anger management issues. This guy should not have even been in the ritual. And now as a guest presenter, I kind of had some red flags about him, but I didn't feel like I was in a position where I could really exclude people from the ritual. And that was my mistake. The wording mistake was letting him in the ritual at all. So what we did, just to give you a quick, how we resolved this, is my co-facilitator went over and brought him from the hearth altar over to me, where I was at the transformation altar, and he said, "Give your anger to the fire. Give it to the fire." So we let him just go seethe in the corner at my altar, the transformation altar, while everybody else was finishing their process. And then we all kind of returned to the center for the next part of the ritual, and he continued. And he eventually calmed down, and he kind of just kept to the edge. And so we let him work it out, because it would have been far more disruptive to actually escort him out. But don't let anger management guy into your ritual.
Thank you, everyone. So just to be clear, this isn't like these are things that can happen if you don't ward properly. This isn't to tell you don't do rituals. That's not... if you walk out of here with the message of rituals are bad and dangerous and I'll never do them, then we've ruined your PantheaCon. I'm really sorry. So don't... But what we are saying here is consider safety, and consider safety a lot, and things can go wrong. And putting effort into safety beforehand will go a long way. I wanted to talk next about the role of the warder. So there are actually kind of some different terms that get used, and I know different groups have different vocabulary that they use. Sometimes there are special titles, and different traditions can at times have like really specific defined roles, or in some cases it's just like, okay, like this is the person who's gonna like hang out and just watch and make sure things are cool. So some of the terms that people use include sometimes people talk about a warder as someone who wards the space and protects the space. A tender who would be warding individual people, not necessarily looking at the energy, but possibly. Sometimes people use the term attendant, which is someone specifically if there's transpossession happening, who will stand near the possessed person, bring them food and drink if they need it, make sure they're okay, and kind of watch over them. There are other terms and things. I kind of want to ask the panelists what kind of roles there are for warders, and some related questions that. Actually, let's start with that, and I'll get to some related questions afterwards about combining them. But first, I'd like to ask you all what are kind of the vocabulary you use for people doing these things. What are their jobs? Who's doing it? And what terms you use? So this is to whoever wants to jump in first.
I will, sure. So in Kaya, we have sort of over the years developed a system of having a warder and a tender, and having those be two separate jobs that have a little bit of overlap and definitely work side by side and in sort of parallel to each other. The warders are there to set up the space energetically for safety, as well as keeping an eye out for logistical safety. I know I myself have been the person to sort of move candles from dangerous positions while warding. I tend to think that also goes hand in hand, the physical safety as well as the spiritual safety. The tenders are people that we have who are either going to be the greeters at the door, although sometimes warders need to be at the door as well, doors being sort of a gateway point that can be very prone to energies getting in, and just needing to have somebody there to look and see if everybody coming into this ritual is somebody that is already, like, especially at PantheaCon, like, are you already, like, kind of way too inebriated for this very intense kind of deep trance state? Does somebody need to check in with that person first before the ritual starts, kind of thing? But the tenders tend to be our door greeters in Kaya, welcoming them. That's kind of a big thing in Come As You Are. And then they're also the person that is the emotional sort of not caretaker, but like some people get very emotional during rituals, especially like deep rituals that have a lot of personal spiritual touching, or as far as like going deep inside sort of thing. And warders are there to keep an eye on the energy and might see a person that is in need of some like tissue, water, a general hug, make sure that they're okay, that kind of thing. But their job is to make sure that the container is still being safe. So then they can go get a tender to go tend to that person. So that way that the job is shared. There isn't creating a sort of hole in the safety of the circle or the space by having the warder's entire attention now on this person who's in need. So that has worked for us so far. Warders are also people who deal with, like, if there's sirens going on outside of the ritual, which has happened before, they need to leave the space and the ritual to go find out if that's something that they need to be concerned about. They're also the people that when we have outdoor rituals in public spaces, which we do in Berkeley, that go and tend to the people that are trying to take photographs of us and are very curious about, like, what's going on? Is this LARP? Like, something like that. So that's how we've split it up in our tradition so far.
You know, for me, so much of it just depends on what kind of ritual or what tradition I'm standing in. I am both heathen and also an initiated Santera, and the way that we do things in Santeria is extraordinarily different than the way we might do things in either a heathen or in a neo-pagan context. In the context of Santeria, there's only so much that I'm allowed to share, but the way that we always would have folks that would be basically always two people assigned to an initiated medium whose Orisha has landed on them. So that's the way that the tradition is structured. That's the way that we do things, at least in my house. Every house is different, but the way that I was taught, that's how we do things there. And in Santeria, most of the folks who are at our events are usually our own initiated folks, and so everybody is taking somewhat of a role in keeping an eye on everybody else. When I'm in more of a heathen, neo-pagan context, things work a little bit differently. And depending on the type of ritual that I am involved with, we set up the warding and safety teams in different ways. So, I have been a member of Storyteller for a number of years, which is a Saith group that does Saith here at PantheaCon and has for many years. When we're doing warding there, we don't necessarily split it up the way that they do, where there's some people that do emotional caretaking, some people that do spiritual caretaking, and some people that do safety checks. But we make sure that our warding team is big enough and with enough varied skill sets on it that we know amongst ourselves, because we always meet as a warding team beforehand, okay, this person, and this person on the team are really good with emotional stuff, so if somebody is having an emotional reaction to something they heard, we're going to send that person over to go take care of them. These three people are really fantastic with energy management, so if we're seeing something energetic, we're going to send them there. And we always have a lead warder, so there's always somebody who is kind of organizing the whole thing, and I find that works really well. When I have been involved with neo-pagan type rituals or events where there is transpossession, usually we do have at least one person whose job it is to stay with the medium while they're in possession. Often we also have somebody whose job it is to take care of the medium after possession has ended, not always the same person necessarily. But a lot of it really depends on the ritual. You don't necessarily need the same level of warding if you're doing kind of a friendly a friendly journey to go meet very benign beings in a very bounded space and then journey back, and it's all very, very protected and all. That doesn't mean things can't go sideways in a situation like that as well, but it's less likely than if you start bringing in stronger magics, stronger energies, and that kind of stuff. So, for me, it really just kind of depends on the specific tradition that I'm landing in and the specific purpose of the ritual in terms of how we organize our teams.
I think River pretty much said most of what I'd say. We both work with Storyteller and do a lot of wording in the same tradition. But I can point out some differences. When I'm working with Storyteller, we have a wording team that is diverse and experienced enough that we can throw who we want where we want. When I work with Freya's Gift, which is another Saith team that's a little different, each of our warders has a job that is theirs, and they aren't messing around with anything else. My niece is Kleenex and water. That's what she does. I stand chair for my sister. My brother watches the door. We've got stuff like that going on where everyone does have a very defined role and nobody's supposed to be cross-working. Again, with Storyteller, we all know each other well enough that we kind of figure out who can handle that thing that just popped up in the corner, whatever it is. But one of the things, if I'm leading the warding team, or if I'm the only one warding a ritual, one of the important things to me is to walk into the space ahead of time when nobody else is there yet. Check it out. Not just for physical cleanliness, but you're at PantheaCon right now. Who knows what was in that room right before you? And who knows whether they cleaned up after themselves? Whether it's our cups and our ribbon papers, or whether, we invoked Cthulhu and then went to lunch. You might want to check your space out before you start using it, and before you've got 30 people in there whose energy is cluttering up what you're checking out.
So I'm going to give two answers to this. One is the traditions that I learned from, I largely come out of the reclaiming tradition and other related traditions. Diana's Grove came out of reclaiming, so it's kind of post-reclaiming. But largely we didn't use the term warding. Ironically, I'm on the panel on warding, but I don't use that term in my work. We do use the term tending, at least in the groups that I was part of, and tending sometimes meant the people who sit with someone who's aspecting or transpossessed, and sometimes tending meant working with the people who are very emotionally distraught by the intensity of the ritual. So those are how I've used the terms. Now I'll talk about how I do these roles and rituals I do. Usually it's just me. Because I am frequently traveling and teaching. I do rituals at pagan prides, I do rituals at festivals, and so very frequently I am it. I am the person making things happen. Now, within my own particular belief structure, that works well because I resolve most of the warding issues by doing a pre-ritual talk. I say, hey, welcome to this ritual. Here's what we're going to be doing. Here are some agreements for behavior. I let people know, like, I don't cast a circle. We cast a circle in the sense that we all connect together. But what I tell people is, if you need to go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, if you need to take some space during the ritual, you're free to go and do that. And if you return to the room, just do so with respect. I outline a number of agreements. I don't usually have to say, don't break out in fisticuffs. That's not something that I've ever had to articulate. I know that there are festivals where you do have to say that. I've not been to those festivals, but so, I resolve, I would say, 99% of my problems just by articulating those agreements for what is acceptable. One of the things that I am very clear about and saves me a lot of grief is I offer the agreement for self-responsibility. So I tell people, if you need to get a drink of water or go to the bathroom, you are responsible for that. And when we're doing, because I do ecstatic and participatory ritual focusing on personal transformation. So often I'm taking people to very dark places, looking into the mirrors of shadow, and that brings things up for people. And that's what I want. I want people to go into those deep places. And yet I need to make sure that the ritual isn't going to break them. Break open, but not break. And so what I offer people is self-responsibility. I say, hey, we're going to go to the underworld, and we're going to do this work. You're going to have an opportunity to work with your ancestors, or do this shadow work over here, or I let people know. So I'm getting their consent, because if they're not ready for that work, they can go at that point, and it's all good. I'm also telling them, if this working is too big for you, do not feel shame about taking a step back. Do what is right for you in this moment. I sometimes will very clearly state, if you have, if we're doing there's a ritual I do where we leave behind, we sacrifice one of our old wounds in the underworld. We leave it in the ground for healing. And I will say, if you have issues of sexual abuse as a child, if you have, and I'll list off a few other different heavy things, this ritual may be too big to hold that. And so if that is the case, just acknowledge where you are. What I am trying to do as well with that is give people the permission to do the work and the choice to not do the work. I also will specifically say, if you are crying, I'm going to let you cry. I'm not going to come over and hug you. I'm not going to touch you. I'm not going to fix you. I'm going to let you have your emotion. If I start crying in a ritual and someone comes over and tries to hug me, I shut down. And so I tell them, if you need to have that emotion, if you need to go and make sounds, go and make sounds. I'm not going to fix you. If you need help after the ritual, let me know, and I will help you. But you have to ask for it. You are responsible for asking for that. And this prevents, there's a term that I learned in the reclaiming tradition called the puking cauldron. The reclaiming tradition tends to like to do transformative rituals, and sometimes they are called the puking cauldron rituals, where people are, having emotional catharsis on the floor, and they're heaving and they're sobbing, and then there's that one person who takes the center stage and makes the ritual all about them and their issues. I don't ever have that happen. Ever. Anger management guy is the only time I have ever had anybody flake out in one of my rituals. So, again, you said just a moment ago, you said don't let this make you want to stop doing ritual. If you have solid agreements in place, that will resolve so many of your issues. You have to have those agreements are boundaries, and they tell people what's acceptable to do and what's not acceptable. And hopefully you don't have to articulate, don't break out in fisticuffs.
Although I would like to say, please don't break out in fisticuffs. Did anyone want to respond to anything there, or it seems like we kind of, so I had asked about the role of warders, but we started to talk about how we do warding. Do we want to keep talking about that a little more? Okay, anyone? All right. No. It's just we started talking about how we do warding. Do we want to keep talking about how we do warding, or do we want to? All right. So the other question about the role of the warder that we went into some here is the question: can you ward and take part in a ritual at the same time? Can you mix the roles of being the person doing the ceremony and being the person warding?
Yes, you can, but the man who is his own lawyer is an idiot. You can, but it's a lot to take on. You're both directing the play and starring in it, and you're going to be the tech crew too? Congratulations, you're better than I am at this, and I've been doing it for 40 years. So yeah, I think you can, but it's difficult.
Yeah, I'd have to second that. It's possible, and I mean, so much of it depends on what kind of ritual you're talking about. The thing is, to some degree, and I want to just voice this because what I'm hearing is that we're using this word ritual as though that's a monolithic thing. Yeah. What in the world do you mean by the word ritual? You know, what do you think is going to happen in that space? What's the purpose of that space? We tend to use the word ritual, especially in these kinds of broader pan-pagan type contexts, to kind of mean anything that folks are doing that maybe kind of sort of is sacred, sort of, but I'm not defining sacred, right? So really the question becomes, what are you doing? What's your intention? What's your intention for the audience or the participants? What's your intention for the folks who are putting the ritual on? If you believe in gods or powers or whatnot, what's your intention with and for them? And so much of that is going to determine how you answer really any of these questions, but particularly the question of whether or not you can participate. You know, if I am doing a ritual, for example, where the entire purpose of the ritual is non-magical, right? Like maybe the reason I'm bringing folks together is because I want everybody to celebrate and remember their ancestors with love and reverence, right? No woo, no journeying, no transpossession, none of this kind of crazy. The whole purpose is that we have love inside of ourselves that we want to give to our ancestors, whether we mean that metaphorically or literally, right? For something like that, as the lead warder, as the leader of the group, as the main clergy person in that, absolutely, I totally can tell a story about my ancestors if that's what I'm having folks do. I can absolutely participate in, pouring milk out into a bowl to give to the ancestors, to make offerings, that kind of stuff. Of course I can participate in that. But again, the question is, what's the intention of the ritual? And that's going to really determine the answers to any of these questions. If the intention of the ritual is for, let me say it this way, the more sort of magic, or what we kind of jokingly refer to as woo or yaya, the more yaya you're bringing into the room, the more carefully delineated I think you need to be about who's doing what and having more jobs. When things get more intense, either you're bringing more magic in or you are coordinating a lot more people. Doing a ritual involving transposition where you're expecting 200 attendees is going to require a very, very different level of delineation of whose job is what than if you're doing we're all going to just cook, 15 of us or 10 of us or 5 of us are going to cook foods that our ancestors ate and we're going to sit down and tell stories, right? Which is an incredibly powerful and beautiful ritual to do and not necessarily the same thing. So again, what are you doing and what's the intention? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just ditto all of that. It really depends on the working that you're doing. It also depends on the space that you're doing it in. Kaya does public ritual, like most of the time. I think we do something like 40 rituals every year, maybe more than that. Most all of them are public, and anybody who sees an announcement can come in. I would say that in that regard, there should always be a warder, at least one. My preference is like 4 at each and every one of those rituals. And they've gotten bigger, and sometimes they're smaller. And so depending on the working that's happening, again, are we just here to like share each other's joy of springtime and give offerings to whomever we're giving offerings to this time, and sing songs and, witness each other's growth, then yeah, I think that the warders can go up and give offerings and still be able to ward and maintain the container. But again, if it's going to be a big, heavy ritual of aspecting or journeying or meditation, those things all are sort of things that take a lot of mental and spiritual capacity. And as a warder, you're already taking up some of your mental and spiritual capacity. And so it's a little bit of self-analysis of how much of that capacity you have and where you can put it and where you need to be putting it in that ritual. If you have been chosen or volunteered to be a warder, you are taking on certain responsibilities, and you are taking on a job that then means that you have obligations to the people that you have gathered together, or that have gathered together and have entrusted you with some of their safety. And that's a big deal, and that's something that you need to consider when deciding to, I'm just going to drop into this meditation that's happening in this ritual, even though I'm warding. So it depends. It just, lots of self-analysis. I'm a big fan of self-analysis.
Thank you.
Word. To the question of, can you be a warder and still participate in the ritual, I would take it back to, can you be a ritualist and participate in the ritual? The answer is yes, and it's going to be different. There's a split focus that you're going to have to develop to be able to do that. And it's not the same. It's not the same experience. Now, what I will say is I went through a process for when I started facilitating rituals, I call it the ritual hump, where, at first I went to rituals and they were magical and they were awesome and I was having these experiences and I was transforming, and then I started taking ritual roles. And then I had this to worry about. And then, I hit this point where I was like, none of it's magical. It's all just facilitation. It sucks. And then as I started planning rituals, I had access to months of preparation for the ritual. So when I start thinking about, I'm thinking about a Beltane ritual, and then I start thinking about, well, what theme do I want to use for this? And then I start thinking, usually it's when I find the chant that I'm like, oh yeah, that's going to take them to the place that I want everybody to be able to get to. And, so I start that work for that ritual months ahead of time. So in the ritual itself, in the moment, I don't always get to do that intensity of work. And yet, if I'm not doing that spiritual work, if I'm just asking you to come to my ritual and do spiritual work, but I'm not going to do that work, that's not really very authentic of me, is it? So for me, it's if we're doing this work in ritual, particularly if the ritual has a transformative element, I must do that work. And yet it won't always necessarily be in context of the specific ritual. It's a longer-term process for me and for anybody who takes on those ritual roles, because we have to prepare for it.
So we're about halfway through right now. It's 4:15. I wanted to ask about, or talk a little bit about some things about more mundane ritual safety. Talking what can we do in terms of practical things to make the ritual safe, to make the safe space. And I actually want to start over on this side this time.
Well, you just said it was the halfway point, and as a point of wording, we need to say that we're recording this ritual, panel again.
We are still recording this ritual. That is still a camera over there. Thank you. If you have, in between the last time and now, begun to object to being filmed, well, you're not being filmed, but begun to be object to being in a place that's being filmed, we're still being filmed. Thank you, you're right.
So, I talked a little bit earlier about my approach to things and letting people know what's going on. That begins before the ritual starts. Like if I've written a ritual description for a program book, I'm letting you know what's going to happen in that ritual before you even decide to attend. If I'm doing a public ritual in Chicago, I'm writing out the description and putting it on the email list and letting you know we're going to the underworld. We're going to work with Shadow. I'm letting people know that because then mostly that self-filters out the people who aren't prepared for that work. A few folks have talked about greeters. That is a huge thing. I once was the greeter at a reclaiming ritual, which is reclaiming rituals are drug and alcohol free, and someone showed up drunk. And I could smell the alcohol on him, and I said, "This isn't the ritual for you." And he was cordial, and he went ahead and left. It wasn't a big deal, but that wasn't the ritual for him to be at. So, the first ritual I ever attended the first public ritual I ever attended when I was 18, nobody greeted me, nobody said hi to me, everybody was off in their cliques. They started the ritual, I had no freaking idea what was going on. I felt like a dumbass. And I didn't go back to rituals for years after that. Greeting is a huge front line of work. Other warding things, I cannot stress the importance of the space. In Chicago, it really isn't viable to do rituals in public parks. That's not really viable for a number of different reasons. So Chicago rituals, I rent a space. I pay anywhere from $150 to $300 for the day for the space. And so yes, I do charge for rituals, but it's donation. And the space, having 4 walls or however many walls, this is maybe 3 or 6, having a door that closes is essential for deeper work. I was asked once to do a ritual. Someone had been to one of my intensive rituals at a festival, and they asked me to do a ritual at their Pagan Pride event. And they said, "Yeah, we really want you to take people down into the depths," and because people were crying and they were releasing, and it was great. And they said, "Can you do that at our Pagan Pride ritual?" And I said, "No." Because you've got the people who are involved in the ritual, and then you've got the pagans kind of standing outside, and they're kind of watching. And then outside of that, you have all the non-pagan folks who are kind of walking through the park going, right. And, people who are being observed cannot dance themselves into a state of ecstasis for the most part. So just that having 4 walls is a huge thing. I mean, even some pagan bookstores. There's a bookstore in Chicago. I love them. A cult bookstore. But their workshop room has a half wall. It's head height. It doesn't go up to the ceiling. So if we're doing an intensive workshop or a ritual, everybody else in the store can hear it. I can't take people to the same depth. So this is just a brass tacks logistics thing. But where your space is really impacts the flow of the ritual and the energy and what you can do with it. Even the fact that you have a ceiling. How many of you have done ritual out in an open field? Where did your sound go? Away. So, things like the seating. Are people warm enough? Do people know that they can sit down if they need to? That's a huge one. I see people who have had knee surgery stand throughout a long ritual because nobody ever told them it's okay to sit. So, again, these are all things working with people's safety. And when people feel safe, they're willing to go into the depths. They have to trust you. Trust is another thing. If you're going to give people directions to your ritual, make sure they're the right directions. How many of you have spent several hours wandering around a park district trying to find where the ritual is? Mm-hmm. Do you really trust those ritualists after that? Not so much. So again, just don't underestimate the logistics of event planning in making your group feel safe. Fire safety is an area where I need some improvement. I could use a fire safety warder.
So could you give examples of good things to do for fire safety to consider or things to avoid?
Well, so I like to use a technique called a cauldron fire. where you have a cauldron. Cast iron really is best, but you can usually find brass cauldrons at Goodwill. You fill it up with Epsom salts, and you fill it up with rubbing alcohol, and you set that bad boy on fire, and you have a very nice indoor fire that is fairly safe. Rubbing alcohol burns pretty cold. It doesn't create a lot of smoke. It doesn't set off fire alarms. It's great. What's awesome also is when you have tested out your cauldron ahead of time, which I always do, but in this case I had bought a new cauldron, and the legs were fastened on the bottom, and what I didn't realize is there was a pinprick leak.
Oh no.
So the altar cloth underneath soaked with alcohol, and there were probably 30 votive candles like on the other edges. The idea was people were going to go process to this station, so it was going to be lit. It was a smaller cauldron, so those only last like about 15 minutes of burn. So those were going to be lit at that point in the ritual. So I'm invoking 3 fire deities in the middle. And it was about 100 people in the room, and so it was about 5 or 6 deep because I bring everybody close. And what I hear is fire, fire, the altar's on fire. And I look over, and sure enough, the fabric was on fire, quite thoroughly burning. And so, I just kind of walked over, and by that point they had moved, other people had moved the votives over and moved the cauldron. And so that's the one great thing about alcohol fires is you can just flip up the fabric and it put it right out. So the moral of the story is test your cauldrons first. I tested the cauldron, but not I didn't leave it in there for long enough. It was sitting there for hours because I had done ritual prep way ahead of time. And so another friend of mine tested a chalice. It was going to be an in-bulk ritual, and the idea was Bridget was going to come into the room with a flaming chalice, which you can do as long as the chalice doesn't melt. Have your pyros test out your equipment.
Anyone else want to talk about mundane safety or mundane ritual safety and things to pay attention to?
Yeah. Well, when we're talking about mundane safety, there's the physical safety piece, which Shauna's definitely addressed very well. And also, even as part of the physical safety piece, think about who's going to come to your ritual and think about what kind of ritual you're going to have. Is there going to be dancing? Is there a chance that somebody might trip over something? That kind of stuff. Do you have somebody who is grounded enough to be able to look through a space and be able to go, okay, there's a big bunch up in the carpet over there and somebody's definitely going to fall over that and we're planning on dancing. Are there enough chairs for everyone? Temperature-wise, is the temperature safe for everybody? All of that kind of physical safety stuff absolutely must be taken into account with anybody who's thinking about planning a ritual, and have that be appropriate both for the ritual you're planning and for the attendees that you're planning on having there. What I would also consider mundane safety would be the emotional aspect too, which again, Shauna definitely has also spoken to very well. Being really, really clear. Communication is so important. Making sure that you are clearly communicating what is going to happen at the ritual, what orientation your ritual group or the ritualist who's leading it has. So, again, like the story that I told to kind of start with, are you being clear about what your own personal tradition or theology is? Because for some folks, that actually is going to make a really big difference about whether that's an appropriate space to be in or not. There's the piece about the mental health piece. One thing that I have seen happen frequently, and I kind of hate to bring it up, but I do see it often at large festivals like PantheaCon, is that folks do get excited about doing sort of deep work type rituals. The ritualists themselves don't always have the skill to be leading folks through psychological journeys. And there's a difference between psychology and spirituality, the way that I understand it. I've seen people go to rituals that were very well intentioned to be, well, we're working with the gods as archetypes and we're bringing people down into the depths and we're doing all this kind of stuff, but then the ritualists themselves aren't trained psychotherapists. They don't necessarily have any background in mental health, and may not necessarily realize that what they're doing may have a particularly big impact on folks who may have PTSD or other mental health issues or that sort of thing. And I mean, I've seen people get really, really broken from very well-intentioned rituals where sometimes the ritualists themselves never even knew that that happened because they go home and fall apart a week later. So, you know, none of this is a criticism of what you're doing because I don't know your background on any of that, but I've seen that happen quite a bit, especially at places like PantheaCon. Some of that is a very directly worded be careful about what rituals you go to. If you have any emotional trauma, any background of trauma, read those workshop descriptions really clearly and really carefully. And know your ritualists. You know, ask folks in the community if you're not sure. I'm a huge proponent of let's talk about each other, not in a gossipy way, but in a clear and clean way. You know, I won't go to a ritual personally if I don't either know the ritualist myself or know people who I trust who know the ritualist, because I've seen too many bad things and I've experienced too many bad things. It's okay to be really, really selective. Just because it made it onto a workshop list at a conference doesn't necessarily mean it's the right ritual for you. So, you know, as the participant end of things, you know, make sure you know what you're going into. As the ritual leader end of things, make sure you're being as clear as you know how to be with your workshop descriptions.
Yeah, I think it's definitely valuable in terms of all kinds of safety and so on, to communicate really clearly, like, here's what we're going to be doing and here's what's going to happen.
The only thing that I might add to the whole mundane aspect of safety and things like that is that, like within Kaya, we do a lot of very large rituals with a lot of people, and we've invested in a first aid kit, like an actual EMT, like first aid kit. We have several members of our coven who have gone through the training in order to first aid and things of that nature. Again, that's kind of the boring, mundane side of things, but when you're outside in a park, things can happen. When you're inside in a building, do you know where the fire extinguishers are? Do you know where your safety exits are? These are all very sort of, you know, practical everyday things, but just even having Band-Aids on site in case somebody like is bleeding or things like that. They're very small things, but in the long run, it goes towards everybody's safety and ultimately everybody's comfort.
So I wanted to talk next about who's doing the warding. I wanted to ask about how many warders do you need, and what qualifications does someone need to be a warder? How do you learn to ward? So I guess the question is kind of who wards and what qualifications do you need?
If I'm choosing warders for a ritual that I'm running, I pick people who have some experience personally with the sort of ritual I'm going to be doing. People from that faith community, if I'm working in a community outside of my own, which I occasionally do, or, you know, if it's in my own community, people that I know are clear-headed, can follow directions, show up when they're supposed to show up, nice things like that. If I am warding a ritual, I will only agree to ward a ritual that I know what's going to go on there. What are your expectations if you're writing a ritual looking for warders? What are your expectations of your warders? Make it very clear to them so that your warders can actually do what you want. I think you're probably hearing a lot of reinforcement from all of us around the idea of clear communication amongst the celebrants and the warding team, and also, like we've said, with the people you expect to come to your ritual. Part of it is you want them to get out of it what you're intending. And if they have no idea what you're intending, who knows what they're going to walk away with? You don't want them there if it's going to stir up their trauma or be a problem for them or for you, things like that. And except in the unusual cases of mystery initiations, you want to be sure that the people that are in your ritual have consented to everything you plan to do there. And your warding team is some help with that too. But the people who ward are the ones with their heads screwed on straight, basically.
Anyone else? Does anyone have comments about specific training that you would want to have your warders have, or that kind of?
Sure, I can talk to that. One thing that I do personally is I teach. It is most common that if I'm going to be putting together a warding team, at least some number of that warding team are folks I trained personally, because then I can vouch for them personally. So I know what their skills are. I know what they're doing. If they're not somebody I trained personally, then they're somebody who I consider to be a peer because I've worked with them in other contexts before. Where do you learn warding? Well, that's kind of a fuzzy question. And again, some of this kind of depends on what tradition you're talking about, what kind of wording you're talking about, et cetera. If you yourself are thinking that you would like to do more warding, it's certainly never a bad idea to start by getting yourself, first aid and CPR certified. Training outside of your tradition, training in other related safety type things. If you have interest or access, getting trained to do different kinds of peer counseling, if that's something that you are interested in doing anyway. I am a certified domestic violence counselor. I'm a certified elder abuse counselor. So I bring a lot of those completely different skill sets into what I'm doing. I love social workers as warders. Oh my gosh, please. Ward. But thinking about it like that, there are quite a number of what you might consider to be more mundane skill sets that translate very, very well. Not everybody on your warding team necessarily needs to be able to go to the on beyond and speak with the gods and spirits and but it's also nice to have at least one of those on your team, so that if that kind of stuff comes up, then you have somebody who knows how to deal with that. There are starting to be more places sometimes where folks teach warding, like you guys. I'll let you talk about your stuff because I know you guys do it. I'm going to be starting to teach classes for the public, which will include a section on warding. Often one of the ways that I see it happen in groups that are more dedicated ritual groups is that the ritual group itself, if they're doing things in a way that I think of as safe, the ritual group will have some amount of training for people in order to start to welcome them into their warding team. Certainly, Hrafnar and Seithyaler have done that sort of thing for our communities there. Again, in my complete other side of the spectrum, when I'm doing Santeria, we're teaching each other. We have a very, very specific hierarchy of of elders and folks who are working with elders in specific ways. So you learn that kind of stuff from your elders in a very, very direct transmission kind of way. It's kind of like that. If wording is something you're interested in, think about what kind of traditions you're already working in and what kind of groups you're already working in, and see if there are elders or mentors there who can teach you.
I'll just speak a little bit because Kaya is sort of, a strange creature that is always evolving and is a living tradition. So the way that we have done wording is constantly in improvement and growing. When we first started, the warders were we people that just naturally said, this is important to us and we're going to do this. And since then, it's become part of the training of initiation into Kaya clergy to go through a warding class. We still have those of us who are clergy who are dedicated to warding. It's pretty much a given that if I go to any ritual, I'm going to be warding, whether or not I'm an official warder. In my experience, I've sort of noticed that you can kind of tell the people who are going to be good at and or might be drawn to warding just by watching their behaviors in group settings. People who tend to like to ward or are going to be good at wording are the people that notice things, who are watching the group dynamic, who notice the little kid wandering off away, far, far away that might get into danger and alert somebody, or the person who is constantly checking the door, or even though they're having a conversation, even though they're enjoying themselves, they're still aware of their surroundings, which I think is something that is invaluable to a warder, of just being able to notice. And then in that regard, being able to react and then hopefully diffuse. So we're in the process of sort of upping our ante a little bit on our wording and trying to get a more cohesive wording training session going on. But I encourage everybody, if you have like a group of people that you get to know, that you get together and you do ritual, even private ritual, if there's somebody that's interested in doing like protective magic, if there's somebody who is always a person that makes sure that the candles don't get knocked over or that somebody's skirts don't get set on fire, then maybe you should ask them if they're interested in taking on that wording for your small group of people. And then I think tailoring your wording to what you do and your personal needs, your personal group needs, is something that can organically come about, which has organically come about for us anyway.
Yeah, I would second the observance. That's probably key. And I would actually take this back to being a ritualist in general. You know, what do I look for? Well, I mean, it's specifically if I'm looking for someone who is going, if I think about warding, you know, if there's a warding fail, what's happening is something is going wrong and we need to change it. And so in that sense, you know, anybody in a ritual role where I need them to be empowered to go and change a situation, so that person needs to go and be willing to do something. That might be going and talking to somebody who is, you know, like anger management guy, going and working with him and maybe escorting anger management guy out. You know, how many of you would feel comfortable doing that? So some of you would. Some of you are kind of going, you know, you have to be willing to go and have that conversation with that person. You know, one of the questions that I've heard is you know, what do you do when someone comes to your ritual and you've started the process of the ritual and some other group leader is attending and they say you're doing it wrong and starts yelling at you? This apparently is a thing. It's not happened to me, but it does happen, you know. And so how do you address that? And I would say that's a warding and a safety thing. You have to be, you know, the people who are doing the warding are the people who are willing to go and step in and ask that person to leave and escort them out. So, you know, we're talking about people who are willing to intervene. Yes, absolutely. Observation, energy awareness. You know, as far as skills, if you're looking to build your skills, start observing people. I mean, it might sound a little creepy, but, you know, start watching people and, you know, watch what's going on in rituals. Watch people around you. What is their body language telling you about them? Are they upset? Are they disturbed? Are they okay? If you're looking to do the kind of more tending role where you're sitting with somebody who has gone through an emotional ritual and needs help processing, sometimes you don't need to counsel them. You just need to sit and be uncomfortable while they cry and not touch them and not try and fix them. You need to let them have their catharsis, and it's uncomfortable. Like, what is our urge to do in that moment? We want to say they're there, and that is going to interrupt for most people, not for all, but learning to just sit there and be uncomfortable, that's a huge skill set right there. So there, and I agree, there are lots of mundane skill sets. You know, if you want that kind of a role, counseling is great. Lots of training outside of the pagan world.
Cool, thank you. So it's 4:40 right now. We have 20 more minutes. I want to have at least 15 minutes for questions. So I think I want to start wrapping up. I want to maybe, so we have two other topics I have written here. One talking about mystery versus safety and informed consent. The other one was about how to ward. I think we've talked a lot about how to ward already. So I want to skip to informed consent and talk about what considerations should we be making for informed consent, what we can do to balance between mystery and safety, of how much do you need to inform people about what the ritual is going to be, and what kind of, like, what concessions we need to make to mystery to make that safety happen. And there's a specific question kind of related to mystery versus safety that I added on here, which is, can you consent mid-ritual? Informed consent. I guess let's go this way again.
I'm a big fan of consent, and I'm a big fan of mystery. And I think that that it's absolutely possible to balance those. I let people know before the ritual, hey, we're going to the underworld. We're going to work with the altar of shadow. Doesn't that sound fun, folks? If you like catharsis, I suppose it does. But I let people know, and I offer that self-responsibility ahead of time. What I will say is so here's an example of a ritual I heard about. I've referenced it in my ritual workshop last night. It's the face melting trance. So this was a Sabbath ritual. It was not in the dark half of the year. The ritual leader it was one of those circle castings where you cannot leave once the circle is cast. He didn't let people know what was going on. He took people down into the underworld where their flesh rotted off their bodies, their eyes melted out down their face. So I call it the face melting trance. Nobody was given the opportunity to consent to this work. Now here's the thing. That's a perfectly appropriate ritual if you're doing death work. If you are going through a trance experience to prepare for death, I have friends who do death midwifery. It's an absolutely appropriate working. If you've said, yes, I'm on board with that. So, I believe that consent is really important, and I think it is, just because I've told you, hey, we're going to the underworld and we're going to work with the altar of shadow, and there will be a bowl of beads, and if you take the bowl and, release something into this bowl of water or, whatever. I tell them the physical logistics because then we aren't stumbling around going, what am I supposed to do with the bead? Just because I've told them that, I don't think it ruins the mystery because when it's in ritual, it's a completely different experience. So I typically, yes, there are little ritual twists, but I don't do anything that's crazy with ritual work like that. And I tell people right up front, you can leave this ritual at any time. You can withdraw your consent at any time.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely a big fan of consent. It's sort of an interesting topic for Kaya specifically, just because we do so much public ritual. And public ritual in such a way with the interfaith part of Kaya makes it interesting because different things mean different things in different traditions. And even though I might be describing something to someone, we'll take the Morrigan, for example. A ritual to the Morrigan to me is a very different creature than a ritual to the Morrigan with somebody else's background, with maybe somebody who's part of like a more Dianic lineage or something like that. And so it's been a process of finding the balance of really being able to get a vocabulary and a lexicon and a voice within our own public rituals. And our clergy, as clergy, we all know that there are some things that are not within the scope of Kaya's voice and are not something that we're going to offer the public because it's not our voice. It's not Kaya voice. If you want to have your personal ritual and do a private thing with members of the clergy that already know each other and you already have that, again, that lexicon, that shared vocabulary, then there's a lot more space for sort of, I would say, the more mysterious, the more, there's already that trust built there. There's a public trust, and then there is we know each other, we've worked together, I know what you mean when you say you're going to have a Morrigan ritual on the beach and a camping trip where we hike 5 miles in.
Thank you.
It's a different thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. I know we're starting to run short on time, so I'll keep it brief. Honestly, I don't necessarily lead or do a whole lot of neo-pagan rituals that involve secret keeping. I just don't. That's not really my kink with this particular part of my community. So if I'm doing a ritual, if we're doing a bloat, we're doing a bloat, and I'm happy to tell you exactly what that means. If we're doing a devotional of some sort or another, I'm going to tell you exactly what we're doing. If there's going to be transpossession involved, you better be sure. I'm going to make sure everybody walking in the room knows that that's going to happen, and I'm probably going to be a lot more specific about who I'm going to even invite. I don't do public. There are certain types of rituals I would never do as just a anybody can show up type public ritual, which is incredibly contrasting to my background in Santeria, where it is entirely a mystery tradition. We keep our secrets very close to the chest for lots of very, very specific reasons, both magically as well as contextually and historically. Santeria is a religion that is an Afro-diasporic religion that was practiced by slaves who were holding their traditions, and nobody could know that this was happening, or there would be dire repercussions. So there's reasons why that secrecy needs to be there. From a ritual perspective, though, some of those secrets need to be in place because there are magical reasons why you need to go into something not knowing what's going to happen. But where the informed consent comes in is that you know that that's going to happen. So if you're going to be involved in this tradition, as you go deeper into the tradition, anybody who is your direct elder is going to be really, really clear with you that there's going to be things that are going to happen during this ritual that I'm not allowed to tell you. Are you okay with the fact that something's going to happen? Depending on what it is, we may or may not be able to give you much more information, but we're going to give you some. And by the time you're doing individual transformative rituals that are going to involve secrets and mysteries, you're already been in the tradition long enough to some degree or another that you have some sense of what that might entail, even if you don't know what that's actually going to entail. A mystery is a mystery. I mean, you can tell somebody exactly step by step what's going to happen, but that's not the same thing as the actual experience of it. Mm-hmm. So, with informed consent, I just try and make sure that as much as I'm allowed to tell is what I tell.
Thank you.
I will ditto everybody else, as well as I like to let people know what the physical expectations of the space and the ritual are. I like my space to be welcoming to everybody who wants to be there. So I need to be sure that if we're going to climb a mountain and do an hour-long dance, everybody knows that, so that if they can't participate in that sort of thing, they don't show up and aren't disappointed. Or if there's something I can do to make it possible for them to participate, we can make those arrangements ahead of time. But they covered everything else.
Yeah, thank you.